Well, hello everyone, this is Crystal and welcome back to my channel. So today we'll continue with our last lecture and finish up this article. So the idea of putting a price on carbon is to encourage individuals and firms to use alternatives to emitting carbon. So recall what we have learned in chapter 3, coal and oil are considered as primary commodities that are rising from the use of natural resources. So from an economic perspective, we know that they are likely to have low price elasticity of demand, meaning the change in price will not likely to change the demand, especially when the alternative technologies that replace carbon are not readily available. So when demand is fairly inelastic, an increase in price after a government imposes a tax, the supply curve will shift up, leading to a higher price level. So this increase in price due to a rising in taxation will lead to a proportionally smaller decrease in quantity demanded and hence to an increase in total revenue. So a carbon tax is supposed to put a price on carbon to make it more expensive and less attractive. So we're hoping that consumers and firms will shift towards other options as a carbon is becoming more expensive. Unfortunately, we see that this is not happening because there isn't enough options for them to choose from in the first place. So Australia relies so much on coal and other fossil fuels for its energy that it is one of the world's highest emitters per head of population. So in 2014's election, Tony Abbott's campaign was centered around abolishing the tax on carbon. And he said that the tax on carbon had raised the cost of business and destroyed job opportunity after a carbon price increase with the tax policy. And that actually helped him gain some popular support from those who are not in favor of taxes. So according to OECD, pricing the carbon correctly is a concrete and cost-effective way to slow climate change. But most of the time, carbon pricing scheme isn't very effective because, as we have already talked about, it is politically different to impose carbon taxes that are high enough to actually make a difference. So for a long time, it remains pretty unpopular among consumers and businesses. It actually makes sense, right? Because for businesses and firms, the cost of production will rise with taxation. And if other countries do not have similar carbon pricing, it will be pretty unfair for them to trade with these nations. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But in 2014, Australia repealed the carbon tax. And another example that the article gave is the European Union's carbon trading. So we have already talked about the cap and trade scheme for a little bit. So under the ETS, the government restricted the total CO2 emission. Basically, it is a market-based solution that requires businesses to buy those emission permits in order to produce and emit pollution. So higher that price, because when supply remains at the same level, the demand curve shifts to the right, and we'll see prices rising. So higher that price, the businesses will have a bigger incentive to switch to other alternatives since the cost of production is rising. But we see European ETS carbon prices are pretty low historically because of excess supply, leading to a price below 10 euros. But in 2014, the UK government actually announced a cap of 18 euros per ton of CO2, and that set up a minimum price, or a price floor for carbon emission. And the arguments here to impose such a price floor is that it would send the signals to the polluters that the price is going to be high, so that would encourage the businesses to invest in other alternative solutions. But here, the Economist article mentions one of the problems behind this. So essentially, companies will only invest in the development of other alternatives when they do believe that the carbon price is going to be high enough to make their investment worthwhile. But we see government seems to be not very credible historically, because for governments or nations as a whole, when price floor is very high, and that might damage the whole entire international competitiveness of those industries that heavily rely on fossil fuels and polluting sources. And that is likely to hurt a country's overall GDP. So now again, this article starts to talk about the revenue-neutral carbon taxation. And it can work efficiently in compensating the individual household that will pay the carbon tax. But only British Columbia so far has done so in a full recycling manner. So another way to compensate the taxpayer is to directly give the money back through a monthly check. So imagine the households will definitely be happy when they get the actual money delivered to them on a monthly basis. So cap and trade scheme is not very easy in general to get implemented since it requires a lot of monitoring of emission. Otherwise, firms will try to cheat by emitting more pollutants than they actually allowed. So here the heavy industry and the electricity generation industry are slightly easier for the governments to monitor. And later, the ETS also expanded the scope to aviation industry and other industries. But when it got expanded, the problem of trade will come up. So we have already mentioned a price floor, or when the carbon price is too high at home, that will make domestic businesses less price competitive overseas. So the European Union actually came up with something called border carbon adjustment mechanisms, and that was designed to motivate the EU importers and foreign producers that are not within the European Union to reduce carbon emission and level the playing field. So the whole entire idea is that the EU will set the standards for the rest of the world by imposing additional costs on the high carbon imports that come from the countries that don't have similar restrictive carbon reduction policies. And at the same time, the EU will give the production within the Union some additional rebates to encourage their exports. And that's the soft economic power that the European Union has, because when it sets certain standards for services and products, companies and firms around the world will likely to implement them because they know that the EU market has great potential. And that will trickle down to some of the EU's big trading partner countries like the US, China, and Russia. So President Joe Biden here is also committed to this idea. But in reality, EU can't just simply impose this border mechanism freely, because the implementation is actually regulated by the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. Because legally speaking, countries can't differentiate the price on similar production. And that's just one of the challenges that the EU is facing right now, which is related to the compatibility with the World Trade Organization legal rule. And another complication is to determine a right levy, or the system will perhaps only do harm to the EU's own economy when other countries have cheaper similar goods and production. Also, later in this article, it mentions an equity problem because there are poor nations that largely depend on dirty exports for their growth. So we can see that BCA is in fact very hard to get implemented, and that's why in many places in Europe, as well as the state of California, they gave out free permits to firms to produce carbon instead. So these companies can gain additional profits and also be competitive on the international market. But the people who oppose free permits say that they will likely to encourage unnecessary pollution, and the EU doesn't want to give out freebie either, because that will reduce the urgency to reducing carbon emissions. So there are already so many potential solutions on the table, but any climate policy will come with some sort of cost and risk, as we can see. So even though they may seem to be appealing and ideal solutions, but we really have to consider all the stakeholders, and oftentimes it is not possible to make everyone satisfied. And there is still a long way to go for the world to fight climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, since there is just so much complication involving in this policy implementing process. So thank you so much for staying. I know this is a super long article, and next time I will promise to choose a shorter one. And if you like this content, please give a thumb up and leave a comment down below, and I will see you next time.